What did ancient people do at night before fire and beds existed? Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a time long before the luxury of mattresses, pillows, and the comforting glow of a bathroom light that you absolutely do not want to turn on at 3 a.m. because you'll never fall back asleep again. A time before houses, before hearths, before anything resembling sleep hygiene. A time when the world became truly, overwhelmingly dark the moment the sun slipped away and humans poor, confused, shivering creatures that they had to figure out what to do with themselves for 8 to 10 hours every night. So, go ahead and settle in. Dim your lights. Let your room fall into a darkness that is pleasantly manageable. Unlike the pitch-black void our ancestors navigated with all the confidence of a damp leaf. Let your breathing slow. Let the edges of your thoughts soften, and drift with me into a world where nighttime wasn't relaxing, wasn't peaceful, and certainly wasn't optional, because tonight we're exploring what ancient humans actually did at night, back when fire didn't exist. Beds hadn't been invented, and the world was essentially one long, terrifying hallway with no exit signs. Naturally, they did exactly what you think they did. They panicked, and then they improvised. But we'll go slowly, softly, gently, because this is bedtime history. Not one of those documentaries with dramatic drumming and CGI wolves leaping at the screen. We're here for the quiet mysteries, the sleepy guesses, and the gradual realization that humans have always been just a little bit clueless. So let's wander back Luoon before royal inbreeding, medieval meltdowns, or kings who thought bathing was treason, before palaces and politics and regrettable dynastic marriages, all the way back to the beginning, to a time when night fell and humans, having absolutely no plan, simply hoped for the best. The world before fire, a night designed to be a confusing picture. The Earth thousands of years ago, not the tidy, over-explained, Google-mapped Earth of today, but a raw, unlit wilderness where the sun dipping below the horizon meant your visual range instantly shrank to approximately nothing. No candles, no torches, no faint glow from the neighbor's window. Just darkness so deep that if you waved your hand in front of your face, you might genuinely wonder if your hand had given up and walked away. Humans weren't built for this. We're good at many things: worrying, overthinking, tripping over objects directly in front of us. But we were not built to see in the dark. Cats, owls, and various creatures with eyes approximately the size of their entire skulls, they had the advantage. We had the ability to stub our toes on rocks we'd personally placed earlier that afternoon. So what did ancient people do when night arrived? Well, the short answer is, they tried not to die. But the long answer is more interesting. It's softer, stranger, almost cozy. In a feral sort of way, let's drift into that. Nightfall, the great human shutdown when the first stars appeared. Ancient humans automatically gathered together, not because they were sentimental, but because anything capable of eating them preferred dining on solitary individuals. Strength in numbers wasn't just a saying, it was a survival plan. Imagine 15 to 20 very tired, very nervous early humans huddling in a patch of grass, pretending they weren't terrified while something moved somewhere out there. In the dark, something with teeth. Naturally, they developed a few nighttime routines. Not routines in the modern sense, no skincare, no journaling, no herbal tea, but simple, instinctive patterns that helped them get through the night. They did 5 main things. They gathered, they listened to the dark, they shifted around nervously, they slept in short, confused bursts, they accidentally invented storytelling. We'll get to that last one in a moment. But first, let's talk about the listening. Listening to nothingness and everything when you can't see predators. You rely on sound, and ancient humans, bless them, spend much of the night listening with every ounce of their attention, not in a calm, meditative way. More like, what was that? No, seriously, what was that? That was a leaf. Oh, wait, what was that? Every rustle, every snap of a twig, every shift of wind became a possible threat. Night was less of a peaceful rest period and more of a prolonged group anxiety session, and because nighttime lasted a very long time, humans had to fill the hours with something other than terror. This is where our ancestors got creative and strangely social. The birth of nighttime bonding without fire, light, or warmth. Early humans relied on body heat, so they slept together, literally, in piles, like puppies. But significantly less cute. Archaeologists call this communal sleeping. But really, it was more like, please lie next to me so the hyenas think I'm part of a much larger creature. The arrangement often looked like this. Elder humans in the center, children tucked between adults. On the outside layers, anyone who had annoyed the group recently placed at the edge. This may be the earliest form of social consequences. But let's drift gently to the most important. Development of nighttime human behavior. The first bedtime stories told out of sheer boredom and fear. Humans didn't invent storytelling because they were creative geniuses. They invented it because sitting silently in the pitch dark for 10 hours every night was driving everyone insane. Someone particularly brave or possibly exhausted. Early human eventually whispered something into the dark. Maybe a memory, maybe a warning, maybe a simple complaint about the cold. Something like, in the morning, I am definitely finding more leaves. Others whispered back, quietly, softly, voices carrying just far enough to soothe, but not far enough to attract anything with claws. And from this, over generations, came stories. Nothing fancy, no elaborate plots, no dramatic twists. Mostly tales of animals. Tales of hunting, tales of ancestors, and tales explaining mysterious noises that absolutely could not have been dangerous, even though they probably were. These weren't thrilling stories, they were comforting ones, sleepy ones. The kind whispered to fill the silence, warm the mind, and nudge fear away just enough to let half-sleep settle in. In many ways, these were the first bedtime stories in human history, long before books, or writing, or monarchs with unfortunate chins. Humans talked each other to sleep in the dark, just like you and I are doing right now, minus the hyenas. Segmented sleep, the forgotten human pattern. Modern humans sleep in one long stretch. At least, we're supposed to, but ancient humans, didn't they slept in what scientists call segmented sleep? Few hours of restless dozing, a natural waking period. In the middle of the night, another. Few hours of lighter sleep during the waking period. Ancient humans didn't panic. It was normal, expected. They used the time to whisper, think, check the surroundings, adjust sleeping positions, and quietly complain about how cold the ground was. So if you ever wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and think something is wrong, congratulations, you're actually behaving more like a prehistoric human and less like a modern one. Your ancestors would be proud, or at least awake with you before beds. What did they actually sleep on? Whatever was not poking them. Grass, leaves, moss, furs, piles of reed-woven mats, or any combination of the above. But these were not beds. They were mildly improved versions of the forest floor. No pillows, no quilts, no embroidered duvet covers in calming beige, just piles of plant matter arranged in hopeful shapes. Occasionally, an early human would experiment with stacking too many leaves and create something resembling a mattress. Unfortunately, It also resembled an invitation for insects. But innovation had to start somewhere. The dark and the sky. Nature's original nightlight before fire. The only sources of light were the moon, the stars, and the reflective qualities of one's own imagination. On bright, full moon nights, humans were calmer. They could see shapes, landmarks, their own knees. On moonless nights, however, the darkness was so absolute that ancient humans likely stayed in groups, barely moving, wrapped in silence and woolly dread. Yet even then, they sometimes looked at the sky, not to admire it romantically, more like, what is that glowing thing? Should we be afraid of it? Probably. Let's assume yes. But even fear can be poetic. Over time, humans began to recognize patterns, constellations, cycles, movements, and these became the first nighttime myths, which of course turned into the first nighttime arguments, which eventually became the first nighttime traditions, all because people were struggling to fall asleep. Some things never change. Safety in shifts. The first night guards even before fire existed. Early humans knew one important survival rule. Somebody should probably stay awake. Not everyone, just one or two unlucky volunteers, usually the younger, healthier members, or anyone who'd annoyed the group earlier in the day. These nighttime watchers listened for predators, rival groups, rogue mammals, and ominous rustling. No one wanted to investigate. The watchers weren't warriors. They were simply awake, staring into darkness, using their imagination as their primary self-defense mechanism. Over thousands of years, this became normalized by the time humans invented fire. The idea of night guards was already tradition, yet in the beginning, they had nothing but their hearing, a stick, and a crippling sense of responsibility. So, what did they actually do all night?
The real wives of the Roman legionnaires tonight were drifting back to a time when sandals were standard military issue. The average lifespan was shorter than a modern houseplant's, and love, at least for Roman soldiers, wasn't exactly allowed. So, settle in. Get comfortable. Dim the lights, if you haven't already. Because tonight, we're going to talk about the real wives of the Roman legionnaires. The women who loved men they technically weren't supposed to love. The invisible families who followed armies across Europe, and the quiet lives that lived in the shadows of empire. This isn't a story about battlefields, or glory, or the sort of marble grandeur Rome liked to pretend it was built on. No, this is about the small human details that empires prefer to forget. The women who carried water, cooked meals, and raised children in tents behind the lines. The wives who weren't wives at all. At least, not on paper. Because, for a long time, the Roman army had a rule. Soldiers couldn't marry. And yet, they did. Just not officially. Let's start in the 1st century CE, under Emperor Augustus, the same man who loved moral reform and hated fun. Augustus, in his eternal quest to make Rome look morally perfect, decided that soldiers shouldn't marry while in service. It was, he thought, distracting, too domestic, too sentimental for men who were supposed to conquer the world. And so, for centuries, Roman soldiers lived under a strange paradox. They could build an empire. They could serve 25 years, travel thousands of miles, and conquer half of Europe. but they couldn't have a wife, at least not legally. Naturally, they ignored that, because when you station tens of thousands of men in far-flung outposts across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, something fairly predictable happens. People get lonely. Villages spring up. Relationships form. Babies appear. And suddenly, every Roman fort has a little civilian settlement growing just outside its walls. They were called canabae, the unofficial camp towns that followed every legion. If you were to wander through one, you wouldn't see marble columns or grand villas. You'd see mud brick huts, market stalls, smoke curling from little hearth fires. There'd be the sound of hammers from blacksmiths, the smell of stew simmering over coals, and, here and there, a woman carrying a child who bore an undeniable resemblance to a certain Roman centurion. Because despite Augustus's best efforts, Roman soldiers did what people always do. They built lives anyway. These unofficial families were complicated. A soldier's partner might be a local woman, sometimes from a nearby tribe or conquered people, sometimes the daughter of a merchant or craftsman. They might live together for years, even decades, but without the law recognizing it. If he died, she had no rights to his pay or property. If he retired, sometimes he would marry her officially. Finally, after 25 years of waiting, but by then they might already have grown children. And yet, against all odds, it worked. Archaeologists have found letters, inscriptions, and even military documents that show these families were an open secret. There are burial stones carved by wives for their husbands, and by soldiers for the women who were, quite obviously, their partners. Some even mention children by name, though the fathers couldn't legally acknowledge them as heirs until retirement. It's a little tragic, but also very human. The empire might have drawn a hard line between soldier and civilian life, but real people blurred that line every day. Let's drift, for a moment, to a cold, wind-swept frontier, northern Britain, maybe, near Hadrian's Wall. It's late evening. The soldiers have returned to their barracks, the sound of marching boots fading into the drizzle. Just beyond the walls of the fort, a cluster of wooden shacks flickers with lamplight. Inside one of them, a woman stirs a pot of barley porridge. A small child sleeps by the fire, wrapped in a rough wool blanket. There's a knock at the door. 2 quick taps. One soft. She opens it, and there he is. Her husband, though not in any official Roman sense of the word. His cloak smells of leather and wet earth. He smiles, steps inside, and hands her a small pouch of coins. His pay for the month. They talk quietly about the day, about a comrade who got promoted, about the letter he wants her to write for him, since he never quite learned his letters. Outside, rain patters softly on the roof. No chronicler ever recorded their names. No historian listed their marriage. But there were thousands like them, living quietly in the shadows of the Roman machine. Some commanders looked the other way. Others pretended these families didn't exist. But everyone knew they did. In fact, the army quietly relied on them. The women in the canopy cooked, cleaned, brewed beer, mended clothing, and even provided medical care. They were the social backbone of every Roman fort, the domestic world that made the military one possible. And in their own way, they became a sort of community. Children born in these settlements sometimes grew up to become soldiers themselves. Traders and craftsmen made their living selling to both the army and the civilians outside the walls. Life, as it tends to, found a way to make bureaucracy look ridiculous, because no empire, however vast, can really control who people love. There's one story from Vindolanda in northern England that gives us a rare glimpse into this hidden world. Vindolanda was a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall, and archaeologists found an extraordinary collection of writing tablets preserved in the damp soil. Basically, ancient letters written on thin wood. Among them is a letter from a woman named Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of a Roman officer. It's one of the oldest surviving letters in Latin written by a woman. In it, Claudia invites her friend to her birthday party, adding with wonderful formality, "I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, my dearest soul." It's not the letter of a lonely, cloistered Roman matron in Italy. It's a woman living at the edge of empire, chatting about birthdays and friendship while stationed in a freezing outpost full of soldiers. It's a reminder that life went on, even at the empire's edge, and that women, though officially invisible, were always there. But the irony doesn't end there. Eventually, after centuries of pretending these wives didn't exist, the Roman state had to face reality. In 197 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus, the same one who spent much of his reign fighting wars and feuding with his own family, decided to lift the ban. Soldiers could finally marry, legally, publicly, without sneaking around. It was, frankly, less a moral decision and more a practical one. Severus needed loyalty, and married men were less likely to desert. He may also have realized that forbidding marriage had done precisely nothing to stop it. So, with a few strokes of the pen, hundreds of years of illegal wives suddenly became legal ones. Imagine the relief or the confusion. All those families who'd existed in the margins now had to be folded into official records. All those children born out of wedlock could suddenly be recognized. After generations of being unofficial, they were citizens of Rome in the eyes of the law. For the first time, the invisible world outside the forts became visible. But of course, empires don't change overnight. Even after the ban was lifted, not every soldier married, and not every woman gained the stability she hoped for. Life on the frontier remained harsh. Forts were still cold, pay was still inconsistent, and retirement, if a man lived long enough to see it, was still the first time many families could settle permanently. Some wives never saw that day. Some waited decades for a promise that ended on the battlefield, and many simply continued doing what they'd always done, holding life together while history marched past them. Because for every statue of a general, there's an untold story of someone who washed his clothes, cooked his food, and kept his children warm. The wealthy and the restless in noble households. The midnight break was an excuse for extra meals, because if you're a count or duchess and you wake up at 1 in the morning, naturally, you deserve a snack. Servants were often required to keep the hearth going all night, ready to prepare night drafts, warm wine, spiced ale, or broth for their employers between sleeps. In royal palaces, this became an event. Some courts kept a midnight hall lit for nobles who wished to wander in, gossip, or play dice while everyone else was asleep. Because nothing says divine right to rule quite like a 2 a.m. gambling problem. It's strange, isn't it? When we think of Rome, we imagine marble forums, senatorial debates, the glint of armor under Mediterranean sun. But for most of the empire's history, Rome was mud and wood and canvas. It was the quiet laughter of children outside a fort, the smell of stew, the sound of boots and lullabies mixing together at dusk. The empire conquered the world, but it was built, sustained, and softened by people who were never meant to exist within its rules. And that's perhaps the gentlest irony of all, that in the heart of the world's most disciplined military machine, love and domesticity flourished anyway, unofficial, unrecorded, but utterly real. Let's drift now to another corner of that empire, because behind every army, every law, and every marble monument, there were invisible lives that kept it all standing. In the next part, we'll wander through those strange, lost professions that history quietly erased. The midwives, the scribes, the water carriers, and the candle makers. The ones whose work lit the world just for a moment before disappearing into the dark. How did medieval executioners live with themselves? Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a time when the air was thick with incense, suspicion, and the occasional smell of burning. Heretic. So get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe. Pull your blanket up a little higher, because tonight's story isn't about knights or kings or shining armor. It's about the people who made sure the justice system ran on time, the ones everyone needed, and no one wanted to sit next to at dinner. We're talking about the executioners. Now, you might imagine them as hooded figures with axes, lurking dramatically in shadowed courtyards, which is fair, because that's more or less how they wanted to be remembered. But in reality, they were much less mysterious, and a lot more miserable. For centuries, executioners lived in the strange space between revulsion and necessity. They were both vital and vile, a living contradiction of medieval society's favorite moral puzzle. How do you punish people for killing? By having someone kill them? It's a question no one ever really answered. They just quietly delegated it to someone else and made sure he lived far away. In many medieval towns, the executioner was literally forced to live outside the walls, beyond the gates, near the gallows, naturally, because nothing says welcome home quite like a collection of slowly decomposing criminals. He was usually given a house by the town, which sounds generous until you realize no one else would rent to him. He often had a small plot of land, too, though he wasn't supposed to sell vegetables in the market, since people worried they might be, somehow, contaminated. Which is fair. No one really wants to buy their turnips from the man who decapitated their cousin last week. Still, someone had to do it, and for most executioners, it wasn't exactly a career choice. Many inherited the job, passed down like an unfortunate family heirloom, fathers to sons, occasionally to brothers or nephews, when someone's head rolled one time too many. There are records of executioner families in places like France and Germany that lasted for centuries. The most famous were the Sansons, Paris's hereditary executioners who served for 6 generations, right up through the French Revolution. Imagine that. Your great-great-grandfather hanged a thief. Your grandfather beheaded a duke, and well, you're just trying to get through another Tuesday, without making eye contact with anyone at the tavern. Being an executioner came with perks in the medieval sense of the word perk, which usually means a small consolation for a cursed existence. They were paid better than average laborers. Sometimes they were given free beer, tax exemptions, or the right to keep the clothes of executed criminals, which, in hindsight, is maybe not the best way to encourage public hygiene. They also had access to one of the more disturbing forms of side income, the body. Trade executioners often sold pieces of the executed as folk medicine, bits of rope, ashes, even hands or hearts, believed to cure everything from epilepsy to toothache. Human fat, in particular, was prized. It was called Armsünderfett, criminal's fat, and was used in salves for wounds. Imagine that. Someone is healing their sprained ankle with lotion made from a pickpocket. And yes, it's deeply unsettling. But remember, this was a world where people still thought bathing was dangerous. Despite all this grimness, executioners were not monsters. In fact, many of them were surprisingly methodical and professional about their work. A good executioner was expected to be skilled, steady, and merciful. He trained, practiced, and took pride in a clean strike. Botching an execution, especially with an axe or sword, could be a disaster. both for reputation and for the condemned, who often had to kneel through multiple failed blows. So a skilled headsman was, in his own grim way, respected, not for what he did, but for how cleanly he did it. In some cities, like Nuremberg or Augsburg, the executioner had apprentices. They studied anatomy, weapon maintenance, and, ironically, hygiene. After all, infections could spread from open corpses, and even the hangman didn't want to die of his own work. Executioners were also expected to perform torture, judicial torture, that is, which makes the whole profession even more disturbing. They were both the instruments of law and its most uncomfortable symbol. They extracted confessions, tested the edges of human endurance, and then turned around to clean their boots and go home to dinner. It's easy to imagine that such men must have been cold, hardened, detached. But the historical record suggests something a bit different. Executioners were often deeply lonely, occasionally philosophical, and sometimes oddly compassionate. Take Franz Schmidt, the 16th century executioner of Nuremberg. He kept a diary. For 45 years, he wrote down every execution and punishment he performed, over 300 in total. His notes are meticulous, clinical, but also strangely tender. He sometimes recorded when a condemned man died bravely, or when the crowd pitied him. And in between the deaths, he wrote about his garden, his family, and his faith. Schmidt eventually retired, became a healer, and received a pardon from the emperor himself. Apparently, even after decades of beheading people, he still believed in doing some good. It's an oddly human ending to a job that most people would rather not think about. Now, let's drift for a moment to the question we began with: how did they live with themselves? The truth is, many of them didn't, at least not easily. They were cut off from society, often forbidden from attending church, from marrying respectable women, or even from drinking with other townsfolk. Their children were shunned. Their friends, few, but they formed their own strange communities. Executioners often married into other executioner families. Their daughters might marry the son of another hangman 2 towns over. Their sons might apprentice under their fathers. Colleague, a small, grim network of people who understood each other's lives and shared the same social exile. Some even became minor celebrities in their regions, admired for their efficiency or fairness. In a few cases, the local children would bring them gifts, bread, wine, flowers, out of both fascination and fear. Because everyone knew the executioner, and everyone pretended not to. There's an eerie poetry in how these men existed, at the very edge of civilization. Their job was to enforce order, but their presence reminded everyone that order required violence. They were the blunt end of justice, a necessary evil, standing somewhere between sin and service. In some ways, they were victims of the same system they upheld. The law needed them, yet refused to embrace them. Society demanded their skill, yet denied their humanity. They were both agents of morality and moral outcasts, and so they lived half-lives, respected by no one, but feared by all. By the late 17th century, things began to shift. The Enlightenment, with all its bright ideas about reason and human rights, made the public less enthusiastic about prolonged torture sessions. The guillotine arrived in the 1790s, a device that promised equality in death and efficiency in practice. It also, incidentally, put a lot of executioners out of creative work. But even the guillotine needed someone to pull the lever. And often, someone came from the same families who had been doing it for generations. The Sansons again. Naturally. They executed Louis XV, Marie Antoinette, and hundreds of others. The irony was not lost on anyone. The royal executioners now executing the royals. When Charles-Henri Sanson dropped the blade on the king, he reportedly remarked later that he trembled at having been chosen by fate for such an office, which is a polite 18th century way of saying, well, this is awkward. By the 19th century, public executions were being phased out. Crowds were smaller. Attitudes had softened, and executioners slowly became bureaucrats, civil servants in neat coats, performing their duty behind closed doors. But the stigma lingered, even in the 20th century. French and German executioners often lived under assumed names. Their children changed surnames to avoid the association. And when capital punishment finally declined, many of them simply vanished back into the anonymity they had never really escaped. The church's favorite hour, meanwhile, the church looked at the midnight waking and thought, perfect. Monks were already rising for the matins and vigils, the earliest of their 8 daily prayer sessions. The middle of the night was seen as a spiritually potent time, when the world was quiet and sin, theoretically, asleep. For lay people, it became common to say short prayers during their waking period. One 14th century English manual suggested that if you found yourself awake at night, it was God's will to call thee from the sloth of sleep to remember him, which is a poetic way of saying, if you're awake, you might as well pray. So the first and second sleeps weren't just physical. They became a kind of spiritual rhythm. 2. Take a slow breath. The rain outside, or maybe that's just your imagination, seems a little quieter now. It's strange, isn't it, how every society, no matter how civilized it calls itself, has needed someone to carry out its justice, and how, almost without exception, it then pretends that person doesn't exist. The executioners of history were never truly part of the world they served. They were tools of order, wielded and discarded, their humanity suspended somewhere between sin and necessity. But they were also, in a quiet way, mirrors, reflecting back the violence that polite society pretended not to see. What happened to the eunuchs after empires fell tonight? We're drifting back through the quiet corridors of empires, places that once echoed with silks and whispers, and occasionally a rather disturbing absence of certain body parts. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, let the outside world fade away for a while. Because tonight's story isn't about kings or queens or the conquests that filled their maps. It's about the people who kept those empires running. The gatekeepers, the watchers, the ones who, quite literally, gave up everything for power, and found that power, like everything else in history, doesn't last forever. This is the story of what happened to the eunuchs after the empires fell. Or, to put it another way, what happens when the most powerful man in the palace suddenly has no palace left. Let's begin somewhere grand. Imagine the imperial palace of Byzantium, Constantinople, a glittering maze of marble corridors, gilded icons, and, naturally, the faint smell of incense and paranoia. The Byzantine eunuchs were everywhere. They guarded the treasury. They educated princes. They even commanded armies. One of them, Narcissus, led the Byzantine forces in Italy in the 6th century. A man who, according to Procopius, was small, elderly, and utterly hairless, yet somehow managed to crush barbarian armies with unnerving competence. Byzantine. Emperors trusted eunuchs because they couldn't start dynasties. No sons meant no rival heirs. No rival heirs meant less stabbing at dinner, in theory at least. But of course, once an empire like that falls, when the Ottomans come knocking and the palace walls finally stop glittering, the question becomes, what do you do with thousands of eunuchs whose entire lives revolved around serving power that no longer exists? Some of them faded into monastic life, because where else can you go when your job title was guardian of the emperor's slippers? Others drifted into local administration under the new regime. A few, it seems, tried to quietly reinvent themselves, managing estates, advising merchants, or simply retiring in small villas that were suspiciously nicer than most generals could afford. They had lived too long inside power's shadow to go back to ordinary life. But without an emperor, they were like priests without a god. The eunuch system wasn't unique to Byzantium, of course. The idea of deliberately removing a man's reproductive equipment in exchange for loyalty is one of those unpleasant things humanity seems to have discovered several times, in several places, like fire, or tax evasion. In imperial China, eunuchs were both indispensable and despised. They served the emperor directly, the only men allowed into the inner palace, the forbidden city's heart. They were his messengers, his guards, his cleaners, and sometimes his spies. And as dynasties rose and fell, Han, Tang, Ming, the eunuchs endured. They were, in many ways, the empire's institutional memory. Unfortunately, they were also frequently blamed for everything that went wrong. When the state treasury mysteriously emptied, it was the eunuchs. When the emperor stopped showing up to council meetings, again, the eunuchs. When the crops failed, somehow still, the eunuchs. By the end of the Ming dynasty, they'd become the perfect scapegoat. An empire could collapse, millions could die, and people would still mutter, "Well, that's what happens when you let the eunuchs run things." But what's fascinating and quietly sad is what came after. When the Ming fell in 1644, and the Manchu armies swept into Beijing, the Forbidden City was in chaos. Hundreds of eunuchs fled. Some disguised themselves as monks. Others, in a last act of loyalty, stayed behind to die beside their emperor. A few simply tried to blend into the city. A difficult task when everyone knows your voice never broke. There's a record from the early Fide, Qing period, describing groups of former eunuchs begging near temples, trying to live on offerings and leftovers. They were relics of a vanished world. Men without families, without purpose, and without the one thing their existence had revolved around: access to power. It's one of the darker truths of history, that loyalty to an empire doesn't make the empire loyal to you. Let's drift a little west to the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate, and later the Ottoman Empire, where eunuchs once again found themselves at the very heart of things. The Ottomans were particularly fond of hierarchy, and their eunuchs came in several varieties. There were the black eunuchs, who oversaw the women's quarters, the harem, and the white eunuchs, who handled the palace bureaucracy, and at the very top stood the chief black eunuch, or Kızlar Aya, one of the most powerful figures in Istanbul. He controlled access to the Sultan's family. He managed the imperial endowments, vast sums of money given to mosques and schools. And, occasionally, he helped decide who lived and who didn't, all this from a man who, technically speaking, wasn't supposed to exist as a social category at all. The eunuch's power was always an illusion, built on someone else's favor. And when the Ottoman Empire began to crumble in the 19th century, so did their world. Modernity came crashing in, with its suits and typewriters and unfortunate ideas about rational government. In 1908, The Young Turk Revolution swept through, and the Ottoman court system began to unravel. The harems were abolished, the palaces emptied, and the last generation of eunuchs, men who had once wielded immense influence, were quietly pensioned off. Some moved into the shrinking shadow of the Sultan's household. Others tried to live on stipends. There's a haunting photograph from the 1920s, a group of old Ottoman eunuchs in faded robes, sitting together in a garden in Istanbul, staring off into space. They look like men waiting for a world that isn't coming back. The physical cost of their service had been permanent. The social cost, too. No family, no descendants, no home to return to. When their palace fell, they fell with it. Not in blood, but in silence. Strange to think of them now as history's footnotes, the quiet machinery behind dynasties that no longer exist. We remember emperors and sultans, but not the people who made their lives possible. Yet for centuries, these men were everywhere, standing behind thrones, holding keys, carrying secrets to their graves. Let's pause for a moment here, because this isn't just a story about the past. It's about what happens when someone's entire identity is built on serving power, and then that power disappears. Eunuchs, in a way, were history's most literal example of self-sacrifice. They gave up the ability to create life in order to maintain someone else's. And when that life, that emperor, that dynasty ended, they were left adrift. Like candles still burning after dawn, it wasn't unusual for 4 or 5 strangers to pile together under a single blanket, a practice that horrified later Victorians but was seen as perfectly normal then. And because of that, the midnight waking was communal. People talked. They whispered secrets. Some prayed aloud. Others told stories or sang quietly to children. Imagine the sound of it. A dark room full of half-asleep voices, murmuring softly in the firelight. Half dream, half conversation. In a way, it's more human than our modern, isolated sleep, where everyone lies alone, staring at their own personal rectangle of light. The beehive medical view medieval doctors had plenty of opinions about the proper way to sleep, most of them questionable. The great physician, Avicenna, recommended sleeping on your right side first, to help digestion, then switching to your left. Others advised going to bed with your head to the north and feet to the south, to align with the magnetic harmony of the cosmos, which probably worked just as well as the owl grease they prescribed for headaches. But interestingly, they were quite aware of the two-sleep pattern. Some even recommended it. Waking in the middle of the night was thought to help digestion, reduce melancholy, and, in one memorable 15th century tract, allow the humors to circulate. It was an orderly kind of sleep, tidy, predictable, with built-in time for reflection, night and the imagination. The waking hours between sleeps were also fertile ground for the imagination. Writers and mystics alike described vivid dreams during second sleep, often claiming they'd received visions or insights after the midnight wakefulness. In folklore, it was believed that spirits and fairies were most active during that in-between time. Not quite night, not yet morning. People who stayed awake too long risked seeing things they shouldn't, which might explain why many chose to pray rather than look out the window. The city that never slept much. In cities, the pattern was the same, but noisier. Night watchmen called the hours. Bells tolled for prayers or fires. Cats fought on rooftops. And in larger towns, taverns often stayed open past midnight. Even in the 14th century, London had a reputation for sleeplessness. Curfews existed, but they were mostly ignored. Bakers worked through the night. Prostitutes and thieves did brisk business. Somewhere, someone was always awake. Yet even in cities, ordinary households still followed the rhythm of two sleeps. It was less a rule and more a shared instinct, like breathing with the world. But don't worry, we're not ending here. Let's drift gently into part 2, where we'll visit the last surviving eunuchs of China. The men who lived long enough to watch television and remember serving the emperor. They're ghosts of 2 centuries, living proof that sometimes even the strangest systems in history leave echoes that hum quietly on, long after the palaces are gone. How did people in the Middle Ages actually sleep? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when getting a good night's sleep wasn't quite as easy as it is now. You might want to settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for a journey into the past where the concept of bedtime wasn't nearly as comfortable or safe as we know it today. So, let's get comfortable, but not too comfortable, because the beds of the Middle Ages weren't designed for relaxation. They were designed for survival. Now, when we think of the Middle Ages, we tend to picture kings and queens lounging in their lavish beds with golden canopies and piles of pillows. The reality, though, was far less romantic. People back then didn't really sleep in the cozy, private spaces we've come to expect today. Their nights were full of mystery, discomfort, and a whole lot of, well, not sleeping. Let's start with the basics. How did the average person sleep back in the good old medieval days? Not in the way you'd imagine, I'll tell you that much. For most folks, the bed was more of a piece of furniture than a sanctuary. And I'm not talking about the kind of furniture we're used to today, with memory foam and adjustable settings. No, the medieval bed was often little more than a heap of straw, laid out on a stone floor or wooden platform, possibly covered with a blanket or a piece of fabric. Soft? Not even close. For those lucky enough to have something approaching a proper bed, like the nobility, the situation was still far from ideal. Take a moment and imagine lying down in a room full of drafts, the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. The temperature would fluctuate wildly depending on the season, leaving you either freezing or sweltering, depending on the weather. And let's not even talk about the smell. With poor hygiene and the lack of modern plumbing, fresh air was hard to come by. It wasn't unusual for the air in a noble's bedchamber to be thick with the odors of body odor, unwashed linens, and something else. Something far more ominous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beds. You see, the medieval bed wasn't just a place to rest your weary head. It was also a space for socializing. Yes, you heard that right. For the upper classes, the bed was often a place where business was conducted. Kings and queens would hold court while lying in bed. People would bring their matters of state to them, and royal orders would be signed in bedchambers. You'd think that all that political intrigue might add a little glamour to the scene, but really, it just sounds a bit like trying to hold a meeting in your messy, half-sleeping den. But back to the peasants. They didn't have beds at all, not in the way we think of them. Instead, many slept on the floor, or if they were lucky, they had a blanket or a rug to lie on. And when I say lucky, I mean it. The wealthier classes might have had a basic straw mattress, but those in the lower ranks had to make do with whatever they could find. A pile of hay, for instance, was a common sleeping spot. I suppose it's a good thing they didn't have Instagram back then, or there'd be a whole bunch of medieval Dadajar blessed posts about dreaming on a haystack. When people slept, they didn't necessarily sleep through the night. No. That whole idea of sleeping in one long stretch was more of a modern invention. People in the Middle Ages typically slept in 2 shifts, with a period of wakefulness in between. This practice, called segmented sleep, meant that you'd sleep for a few hours, then wake up for a bit in the middle of the night to do things like pray, have a snack, or just wander around in the dark. Because why not? It wasn't unusual to get up and visit neighbors, or even go out for a stroll in the moonlight. I mean, when you've got a bed full of hay and you've just finished off a hearty bowl of gruel for dinner, why not take a midnight walk? People might also visit the hearth, that ever-glowing central feature of medieval homes. The warmth of the fire was a comfort to people trying to drift off to sleep, but it also brought its own dangers. This is where we begin to see a peculiar bit of irony. The hearth, while a source of warmth, was also a source of danger. Fires could, and did, frequently break out. It wasn't uncommon for whole villages to burn down in the middle of the night, and a bed full of hay was just a tinderbox waiting to be ignited. Let's talk about bedbugs for a moment. Yes, medieval people had them too. In fact, they were a constant nuisance in royal households. Kings and queens, who would have had the best, softest, most luxurious beds, still had to contend with these tiny, blood-sucking pests. It was an unfortunate fact of medieval life. If you were a noble, there were only so many servants you could blame before it was clear that even the most opulent bedding wasn't immune to these tiny little invaders. How comforting. And then there's the matter of personal space. For most people, there wasn't any. People didn't sleep alone. That's right. Sharing a bed was the norm. And we're not just talking about a spouse here. It was common for multiple people, children, cousins, servants, to sleep together, often in a single cramped bed. This practice was seen as perfectly normal, even if it meant contending with snoring, tossing, turning, and a complete lack of privacy. It wasn't until later centuries that the idea of a bedroom really took hold. Back then, the concept of a private space to sleep, read, or reflect was a luxury that only a few could afford. Kings and queens might have had their own rooms, but they were often visited by countless servants, courtiers, and yes, even family members. Now, let's take a small detour into the world of royal sleep habits. Kings and queens were, of course, no strangers to the struggle for a good night's rest. Many of them had elaborate sleeping arrangements. Edward III of England, for instance, had a bed that was so heavily adorned with tapestries and cushions, it practically consumed the person lying in it. And yet, despite the opulence, he had to deal with the same struggles as everyone else. Royalty, too, had to contend with drafts, pests, and the occasional burning hearth. In fact, it's said that some medieval royals preferred to sleep in their clothes, particularly in times of political unrest. Wearing armor to bed was not uncommon. After all, when you're constantly at war or trying to fend off assassination attempts, it's probably best to sleep in your armor. And if the pressure to keep your crown on your head at all times wasn't enough, imagine trying to get a full night's rest while wearing a suit of chainmail. Royalty might have been able to sleep on fancier mattresses, but they were just as likely to suffer the same sleep disturbances as their peasant counterparts. But let's ease up on the royal drama for a second. The real challenges in medieval sleep came from the basic lack of comfort. After all, it's hard to sleep well when you're lying on a bed full of feathers and straw, and the world outside is just as unpredictable as the world inside your room. Whether you were a peasant or a prince, there was always a sense of discomfort that lingered, keeping you awake just a little longer than you'd like. So, as we slip into sleep tonight, consider that in medieval times, your chance of restful slumber was probably about as good as a night without bedbugs or fires. So, next time you're lying down in your comfortable bed, consider this. At least you don't have to share your bed with a dozen cousins, sleep in your armor, or worry about the smell of wet straw. The luxury of darkness. The more you read about medieval sleep, the more you realize how rare true darkness has become. Back then, when the fire burned low and the candles went out, darkness was total, deep, velvety, almost physical. People spoke of it with reverence and fear. To wake in that kind of night must have been disorienting and magical all at once. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. The world outside your door was invisible. And maybe that was part of the peace. There's a reason monks called the night the Great Silence. What ended the two sleeps? So what happened? When did humans stop waking up halfway through the night to pray, think, or wander around in their nightshirts? The short answer: lamps, clocks, and capitalism. By the 18th century, artificial lighting became cheaper and more reliable. People began staying up later, reading or working long into the night. Bedtimes shifted forward, and that natural midnight gap disappeared. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution demanded strict schedules. Factory whistles didn't care about humors or circadian rhythms. Employers wanted workers who could rise early and stay alert all day. And so the idea of one long, unbroken sleep, 8 solid hours of productivity recovery. Time became the new ideal. Biphasic. Sleep faded quietly from memory. Many people today naturally wake up at night for an hour or so, often, worrying that something's wrong with them. In truth, it might just be a leftover echo of the medieval pattern. Some modern sleep experiments have tried reviving the two-sleep schedule. Volunteers report feeling calmer, more rested, and oddly content, as if the rhythm makes sense to the body in a way modern life doesn't. Maybe it's the silence. Maybe it's the permission to wake without panic. Or maybe we just secretly miss living in sync with the dark. The embers glow in the hearth. Outside, the world is silent, except for an owl and maybe a snoring neighbor. You stir from your first sleep, light a candle, and sit quietly for a moment. You might pray. You might think about tomorrow's chores. You might simply listen to the night breathing around you. And then, when your eyelids grow heavy again, you slip back into your second sleep. Calm, unhurried, and perfectly in rhythm with the turning earth. The real wives of the Roman legionnaires tonight. We're drifting back to a time when sandals were standard military issue. The average lifespan was shorter than a modern houseplant's, and love, at least for Roman soldiers, wasn't exactly allowed. So, settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, because tonight we're going to talk about the real wives of the Roman legionnaires, the women who loved men they technically weren't supposed to love, the invisible families who followed armies across Europe, and the quiet lives that lived in the shadows of empire. This isn't a story about battlefields or glory or the sort of marble grandeur Rome liked to pretend it was built on. No. This is about the small human details that empires prefer to forget. The women who carried water, cooked meals, and raised children in tents behind the lines. The wives who weren't wives at all, at least not on paper. Because for a long time the Roman army had a rule. Soldiers couldn't marry, and yet they did, just not officially. Let's start in the 1st century CE, under Emperor Augustus, the same man who loved moral reform and hated fun. Augustus, in his eternal quest to make Rome look morally perfect, decided that soldiers shouldn't marry while in service. It was, he thought, distracting, too domestic, too sentimental for men who were supposed to conquer the world. And so, for centuries, Roman soldiers lived under a strange paradox. They could build an empire. They could serve 25 years, travel thousands of miles, and conquer half of Europe. But they couldn't have a wife, at least not legally. Naturally, they ignored that, because when you station tens of thousands of men in far-flung outposts across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, something fairly predictable happens. People get lonely, villages spring up, relationships form, babies appear, and suddenly every Roman fort has a little civilian settlement growing just outside its walls. They were called Canabae, the unofficial camp towns that followed every legion. If you were to wander through one, you wouldn't see marble columns or grand villas. You'd see mud brick huts, market stalls, smoke curling from little hearth fires. There'd be the sound of hammers from blacksmiths, the smell of stew simmering over coals, and, here and there, a woman carrying a child who bore an undeniable resemblance to a certain Roman centurion. Because despite Augustus's best efforts, Roman soldiers did what people always do. They built lives anyway. These unofficial families were complicated. A soldier's partner might be a local woman, sometimes from a nearby tribe or conquered people, sometimes the daughter of a merchant or craftsman. They might live together for years, even decades, but without the law recognizing it. If he died, she had no rights to his pay or property. If he retired, sometimes he would marry her officially. Finally, after 25 years of waiting, but by then they might already have grown children. And yet, against all odds, it worked. Archaeologists have found letters, inscriptions, and even military documents that show these families were an open secret. There are burial stones carved by wives for their husbands, and by soldiers for the women who were, quite obviously, their partners. Some even mention children by name, though the fathers couldn't legally acknowledge them as heirs until retirement. It's a little tragic, but also very human. The empire might have drawn a hard line between soldier and civilian life, but real people blurred that line every day. Let's drift for a moment to a cold, wind-swept frontier. Northern Britain, maybe, near Hadrian's Wall. It's late evening. The soldiers have returned to their barracks, the sound of marching boots fading into the drizzle. Just beyond the walls of the fort, a cluster of wooden shacks flickers with lamplight. Inside one of them, a woman stirs a pot of barley porridge. A small child sleeps by the fire, wrapped in a rough wool blanket. There's a knock at the door, 2 quick taps, one soft. She opens it, and there he is, her husband, though not in any official Roman sense of the word. His cloak smells of leather and wet earth. He smiles, steps inside, and hands her a small pouch of coins. His pay for the month? They talk quietly about the day, about a comrade who got promoted, about the letter he wants her to write for him, since he never quite learned his letters. Outside, rain patters softly on the roof. No chronicler ever recorded their names. No historian listed their marriage. But there were thousands like them, living quietly in the shadows of the Roman machine. Some commanders looked the other way. Others pretended these families didn't exist. But everyone knew they did. In fact, the army quietly relied on them. The women in the canopy cooked, cleaned, brewed beer, mended clothing, and even provided medical care. They were the social backbone of every Roman fort, the domestic world that made the military one possible. And in their own way, they became a sort of community. Children born in these settlements sometimes grew up to become soldiers themselves. Traders and craftsmen made their living selling to both the army and the civilians outside the walls. Life, as it tends to, found a way to make bureaucracy look ridiculous. Because no empire, however vast, can really control who people love. There's one story from Vindolanda in northern England that gives us a rare glimpse into this hidden world. Vindolanda was a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall, and archaeologists found an extraordinary collection of writing tablets preserved in the damp soil. Basically, ancient letters written on thin wood. Among them is a letter from a woman named Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of a Roman officer. It's one of the oldest surviving letters in Latin written by a woman. In it, Claudia invites her friend to her birthday party, adding with wonderful formality, "I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, my dearest soul." It's not the letter of a lonely, cloistered Roman matron in Italy. It's a woman living at the edge of empire, chatting about birthdays and friendship while stationed in a freezing outpost full of soldiers. It's a reminder that life went on, even at the empire's edge, and that women, though officially invisible, were always there. But the irony doesn't end there. Eventually, after centuries of pretending these wives didn't exist, the Roman state had to face reality. In 100 Trajan, 197 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus, the same one who spent much of his reign fighting wars and feuding with his own family, decided to lift the ban. Soldiers could finally marry, legally, publicly, without sneaking around. It was, frankly, less a moral decision and more a practical one. Severus needed loyalty, and married men were less likely to desert. He may also have realized that forbidding marriage had done precisely nothing to stop it. So, with a few strokes of the pen, hundreds of years of illegal wives suddenly became legal ones. Imagine the relief or the confusion. All those families who'd existed in the margins now had to be folded into official records. All those children born out of wedlock could suddenly be recognized. After generations of being unofficial, they were citizens of Rome in the eyes of the law. For the first time, the invisible world outside the forts became visible. But of course, empires don't change overnight. Even after the ban was lifted, not every soldier married, and not every woman gained the stability she hoped for. Life on the frontier remained harsh. Forts were still cold, pay was still inconsistent, and retirement, if a man lived long enough to see it, was still the first time many families could settle permanently. Some wives never saw that day. Some waited decades for a promise that ended on the battlefield, and many simply continued doing what they'd always done, holding life together while history marched past them. Because for every statue of a general, there's an untold story of someone who washed his clothes, cooked his food, and kept his children warm, the wealthy and the restless, in noble households. The midnight break was an excuse for extra meals, because if you're a count or duchess and you wake up at 1 in the morning, naturally, you deserve a snack. Servants were often required to keep the hearth going all night, ready to prepare night drafts, warm wine, spiced ale, or broth for their employers between sleeps. In royal palaces, this became an event. Some courts kept a midnight hall lit for nobles who wished to wander in, gossip, or play dice while everyone else was asleep, because nothing says divine right to rule quite like a 2 a.m. gambling problem. It's strange, isn't it? When we think of Rome, we imagine marble forums, senatorial debates, the glint of armor under Mediterranean sun. But for most of the empire's history, Rome was mud and wood and canvas. It was the quiet laughter of children outside a fort, the smell of stew, the sound of boots and lullabies mixing together at dusk. The empire conquered the world, but it was built, sustained, and softened by people who were never meant to exist within its rules. And that's perhaps the gentlest irony of all, that in the heart of the world's most disciplined military machine, love and domesticity flourished anyway. Unofficial, unrecorded, but utterly real. Let's drift now to another corner of that empire, because behind every army, every law, and every marble monument, there were invisible lives that kept it all standing. In the next part, we'll wander through those strange, lost professions that history quietly erased. The midwives, the scribes, the water carriers, and the candle makers, the ones whose work lit the world just for a moment before disappearing into the dark. Born on the wrong side of the crown tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history, one that doesn't sparkle quite as much as the official portraits, though in truth it might be more interesting. We're talking about royal bastards, children who were born into palaces, but not quite of them, who had the wrong mother, or the wrong paperwork, or just the wrong timing. They were raised in the orbit of power, close enough to feel its warmth, but never quite allowed to touch it. And throughout history, there have been thousands of them. Some became knights, generals, and popes. Others were quietly erased, their names buried along with the scandal. But they all shared one strange, unshakable thing. They existed as living proof that kings were human, which, of course, was very inconvenient for the monarchy. Now, before we go too far, it's worth remembering that the word bastard wasn't always so sharp-edged. In the Middle Ages, it was a legal term, blunt, but not necessarily cruel. If you were born outside a sanctioned marriage, you were simply illegitimate. Not necessarily unloved, just politically problematic, because royal blood was serious business. It determined who got land, who wore crowns, and who got to sit on uncomfortable chairs in very cold rooms. And if a king started handing out royal privileges to all his children, legitimate or not, the entire system of inheritance would unravel faster than a Tudor marriage. So, bastards were both part of and excluded from royal life. They often grew up near the court, sometimes raised with the legitimate heirs, but always reminded of their status, a permanent asterisk next to their name. Still, there's something oddly human about their stories. They show us the cracks in the perfect marble facade of monarchy, the secret affairs, the jealous queens, the awkward family dinners where everyone pretends nothing's wrong. Let's start gently with William the Conqueror, one of the most famous illegitimate children in all of history. Born in Normandy around 1028, he was the son of Duke Robert I and a woman named Herleva, who, depending on which chronicler you read, was either a tanner's daughter or a sort of casual girlfriend. The chroniclers didn't like that. They preferred their rulers to come from a line of saints in silk sheets, not leather aprons. So they gave him a nickname, William the Bastard, which sounds like an insult, and it was, but also a very literal descriptor. And yet, William never seemed particularly bothered by it. He carried the title like armor. He grew up knowing everyone was watching for him to fail, and somehow that seemed to make him more determined not to. By the age of 8, he was Duke of Normandy. By the age of 38, he was King of England. And as if to spite every noble who'd ever sneered at him, he conquered an entire country. The chroniclers, with their usual restraint, decided this meant divine approval. Apparently, God didn't mind illegitimacy as long as it came with good swordsmanship. So William's story set a strange precedent. that being a royal bastard didn't have to ruin your prospects. If anything, it could make you stronger, at least if you had an army. Of course, not every illegitimate royal had that kind of luck. Most lived quieter, humbler lives. But even the quieter stories have their strange beauty. Let's drift now to medieval France. Because France, more than almost any other monarchy, had a knack for producing royal bastards, and, more impressively, for pretending it hadn't. The French court was full of them. Sons and daughters of kings, dukes and cardinals, tucked neatly into country estates, given modest titles, and quietly funded by the crown. They were acknowledged, which was a crucial difference. If a king publicly recognized his illegitimate child, that child could still live a fairly privileged life, not royal exactly, but comfortably adjacent. Louis XIV, for example, acknowledged more than a dozen illegitimate children. And in true Louis fashion, he didn't just provide for them. He married them into the nobility, because of course he did. Louis's mistresses, like the famous Madame de Montespan, weren't exactly discreet. And when your king has a private palace built solely for entertaining lovers, discretion isn't really the point. But Louis had the advantage of being Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who turned Versailles into the most glittering and perfumed court in Europe. When he acknowledged his children, people politely applauded. After all, if the Sun King's love affairs illuminated half of France, who were they to complain about the heat? Still, for every royal bastard who thrived, there were dozens who simply vanished. Because the line between acknowledgement and denial was everything. An acknowledged child could inherit property, titles, and legitimacy by royal decree. An unacknowledged one could be raised in a convent and never speak their parents' name again. Kings, being kings, often changed their minds. Richard III of England, for instance, openly recognized two of his illegitimate children, John and Catherine, and arranged respectable marriages for them. But when it came to his legitimate nephews, the famous princes in the Tower, well, he was less generous. And that's the strange paradox. Illegitimate children were often safer than legitimate ones. No one saw them as a threat to the throne. They were politically useless, which, in medieval terms, meant they were left alive. Of course, illegitimacy didn't always start with scandal. Sometimes it started with paperwork. Royal marriages were complicated, and if the church decided a marriage was invalid, for reasons ranging from too closely related to you forgot to ask the Pope first, then every child from that union became, legally, a bastard. This happened infamously to the children of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England, who nearly divorced before deciding to simply start multiple civil wars instead. and again to the offspring of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, when the latter declared his first marriage void. Suddenly, their daughter Mary, who had been Princess of Wales, was downgraded to Lady Mary. It wasn't her fault, but legitimacy, like monarchy itself, had very little to do with fairness. Then there were the gray areas, the royal bastards who weren't royal enough to rule, but too royal to ignore. Take Henry Fitzroy, the acknowledged illegitimate son of Henry VIII. Henry adored him, gave him land, titles, and even considered naming him heir. He was the ideal Tudor son, loyal, healthy, and very much not a daughter. Unfortunately, he died of tuberculosis at 17, and that was that. His death left Henry VIII in the awkward position of realizing that he'd executed, divorced, or alienated nearly every other person who could carry his name. In the end, the Tudor dynasty would sputter out entirely, which, if we're being honest, was probably karmic balance for naming your son Fitzroy, literally son of the king, as if daring fate to intervene. But the real fascination of royal bastards lies not just in their misfortune, but in how society bent itself to accommodate them. In the medieval and Renaissance worlds, bloodline was everything. So when kings had illegitimate children, entire bureaucratic systems developed to manage them. There were polite euphemisms, natural sons, children of grace, of the left hand. There were laws allowing legitimization by royal decree if it became politically useful. And there were even orders of chivalry and court positions reserved for them. For example, in Spain and Portugal, illegitimate royal sons often became commanders of military orders, prestigious roles that kept them close to power, but out of the line of succession. It was a delicate balancing act, honor without danger, privilege without ambition. Let's pause for a moment and imagine what that must have felt like. To grow up in a palace, surrounded by your half-siblings, eating from the same gold plates, and know that you were, officially, less real than they were. To be told that you shared your father's blood, but not his name, that your future would depend entirely on his mood, and his wife's tolerance. It must have been a strange existence, a mix of luxury and loneliness. And yet, some of them managed to build identities that outshone their fathers. Take Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles III, born to a servant woman, raised in secret, and eventually acknowledged by the emperor himself. He grew into one of the most famous military commanders of the 16th century, leading the Holy League to victory at the Battle of Lepanto, defeating the Ottoman fleet in one of the largest naval battles in history, all while carrying the label bastard for life. But if it bothered him, he never showed it. He wore it like a badge, the mark of someone who'd fought for everything he had. And that, in a way, is what defines so many of these stories. Quiet resilience. Royal bastards lived on the border between power and obscurity. They were reminders that kings sinned, queens forgave, sometimes, and bloodlines were never quite as pure as they claimed to be. Sleep as a social thing. What's striking about all this is that medieval sleep was rarely private. Most families slept together, sometimes in one bed, sometimes in the same room, often with servants or guests nearby. Even travelers shared beds in inns, so tonight, as we drift through the candle-lit corridors of royal palaces, we'll meet a few more of them, the forgotten, the favored, and the inconvenient, the ones who rose above scandal, and the ones history pretended not to notice. Because while the crown might have denied them legitimacy, history eventually gave them something far better. A quiet profession tonight. We're drifting back to the Middle Ages, the age of castles, candles, and public decapitations. It's the kind of time period that seems far away, but somehow always a little too familiar. You can almost smell the wood smoke, the damp stone, the faint trace of roasted, something that may or may not have been bread. But tonight's story isn't about knights or kings. It's about the people who cleaned up after them. Because for every grand royal decree, there was someone at the bottom of the chain who had to make it happen, and that someone was the executioner. Now, it's easy to imagine medieval executioners as shadowy figures, silent, hooded, maybe brooding somewhere in a tower, sharpening an axe for dramatic effect. But in reality, their lives were less like horror films and more like bureaucratic nightmares. You see, being an executioner wasn't a full-time job in most medieval towns. No one was getting executed every day. Most of the time, these people were waiting for the next hanging, waiting for the next thief to be sentenced, waiting for someone to mess up badly enough that they'd be called in to do their one very specific duty. And in the meantime, they had to live. They had to buy groceries, pay rent, maybe even raise a family, which immediately created a problem. Because medieval people, being medieval, didn't really like being reminded of death. They loved watching it, especially when it involved a dramatic beheading. But they didn't want to live next door to the person who did it. So, executioners were outcasts, but useful ones. It's the same strange contradiction that runs through medieval society like a crooked thread. They needed executioners desperately, and they despised them equally. Most towns refused to let them live within the walls. So, the executioner's house, if you can call it that, was often just outside the gates, on a lonely road where the smell of the gallows carried on the wind. If that sounds bleak, don't worry, it gets worse. Executioners couldn't easily buy food or drink. Bakers and butchers often refused to sell to them, worried that handling tainted hands would ruin business. So, many executioners grew their own food, kept their own livestock, and occasionally took up slightly illegal side hustles. Some became healers, and oddly enough, quite popular ones, because if you spend all day cutting people apart, you tend to learn a few things about putting them back together. It wasn't uncommon for a condemned man to be patched up by the same executioner who would, weeks later, take his head off. The Middle Ages were full of these small, uncomfortable ironies. Executioners also developed a reputation for being surprisingly good at handling wounds, setting bones and mixing herbs, not out of kindness, necessarily, just necessity. After all, when your only official income comes from occasional executions, you get creative. Let's drift for a moment to a small German town in the 16th century, because Germany, bless it, has given us some of the best documented executioners in history. There's one man we actually know quite a lot about, Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg. He lived from 1555 to 1634, and, unlike most men of his profession, he kept a journal. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most unnervingly calm diaries in existence. Each entry reads something like, Tuesday, beheaded 1 thief. Wednesday, flogged 2 women. Thursday, executed 1 murderer. Friday, tended to a man with a broken leg. No commentary, no emotion, just methodical, like a municipal employee filing reports. And that's because, for all the drama surrounding their work, most executioners were bureaucrats in practice. They served the court. They had rules, procedures, pay rates. They were part of the machinery of justice. The messy, medieval, very human kind, Schmidt himself executed nearly 400 people in his lifetime, and flogged, branded, or mutilated hundreds more. Yet, he also became known as a skilled healer. People came to his home seeking treatment for wounds, abscesses, or the lingering after-effects of torture. It's strange to imagine him, the city's executioner, tending to a sick child with the same hands that, days earlier, had held a sword. But again, that was medieval reality. Moral lines were blurry, and practicality usually won. In the quieter stretches between executions, Schmidt and his peers kept busy with civic duties. Executioners were responsible not just for killing people, but for cleaning up the aftermath. Disposing of bodies, maintaining the gallows, removing the limbs of the freshly punished, and hanging them in neat, gruesome displays at crossroads. Essentially, they were medieval sanitation workers, but for justice, Some cities even required executioners to handle animal control. If there was a rabid dog or a stray pig running amok, the executioner was sent to deal with it. A practical choice, since no one else wanted to. It's one of those job descriptions that just kept expanding. Executioner became shorthand for man who deals with unpleasant things. Over time, they also took on roles like grave digging, cesspit cleaning, or operating the torture devices used during interrogations. Because of course they did. If you wanted something morally gray done quietly, the executioner was your man. Now, despite this grim portfolio, executioners were often surprisingly well paid. Cities recognized that if they didn't compensate them decently, no one would take the job. In many towns, the executioner earned a regular salary, sometimes comparable to a skilled tradesman, along with free housing. They also got bonuses per job, a few coins for a flogging, more for an execution, and a bit extra if they had to travel to another town. Some even received wine or meat as payment, though often from a safe distance. But the money came with a curse. The stigma of their work didn't stop with them. Their children inherited it. Executioner families became quasi-hereditary castes, trapped in the profession because no one else would marry them. It wasn't uncommon for sons to succeed fathers as official executioners, not out of passion, but because no respectable guild would take them. You couldn't become a carpenter or a baker if your father was the hangman, so you became a hangman too. There's something almost tragic in that generational loop. The quiet passing of the axe, like a family heirloom no one asked for. Let's linger for a moment on what that life might have felt like. Imagine walking into town on market day. The streets are lively, full of smells. Bread, ale, horse manure. You go to buy grain, but the stall keeper's face changes when he recognizes you. The chatter quiets just slightly. You hear the word shinder whispered. Skinner, a common insult for executioners. You keep your head down, pay quickly, and leave before anyone can refuse service. Later, as you pass through the gate back toward your lonely cottage, the guard doesn't make eye contact. It's not hatred. Exactly. Just discomfort. That uneasy medieval awareness that your existence is necessary, but better ignored. So, you retreat to your house at the edge of town. Maybe you work in your garden. Sharpen your sword. Tend to a neighbor's wound after dark, when no one can see them visiting, and you wait for the next summons. Some executioners developed coping mechanisms. Alcohol was common. So were rituals, small acts of prayer or routine before a job. Franz Schmidt was meticulous in his preparation. He practiced his swings. He studied anatomy. He kept his blades in perfect condition and dressed carefully for each execution. It sounds cold, but it was also a form of professionalism. He took pride in causing as little suffering as possible, which, in the context of the 16th century, counted as compassion, a clean beheading, one swift strike. That was the mark of a good executioner. A messy one could spark riots, because public executions were performances. Crowds gathered not only for justice, but for spectacle. The executioner's skill could make or break the mood of an entire square. And when he did well, people cheered. Then, a few hours later, they pretended not to know him again. It's an emotional dissonance that runs deep through medieval life. Everyone wanted justice, but no one wanted to meet the man who delivered it. There's an odd sort of poetry in how methodical it all was. The condemned would arrive. Thy charges were read. A priest would murmur, last. Rites, and the executioner, silent and composed, would do his job. Then life went on. The crowd dispersed. Children played in the square again. Meanwhile, the executioner gathered his tools, wiped the blade clean, and returned home to his vegetable patch. Maybe he fed his chickens. Maybe he checked his herbs, because after all, he had patients coming later. And they didn't care what he'd done that morning, only that he knew how to heal. So, when we ask, what did medieval executioners do when they weren't killing people? The answer is simple and complicated. They lived small, practical lives on the edges of society. They gardened, they mended, they healed, they drank, they waited for work that no one else wanted to acknowledge. It was a quiet kind of existence, lonely but steady, a profession that demanded both precision and a peculiar kind of emotional distance. And somehow they endured, generation after generation, until the world slowly changed around them, until execution became mechanized, sanitized, hidden behind prison walls. But in the Middle Ages, the executioner was part of the fabric of life, visible, necessary, and quietly tragic. Let's drift next into the stranger corners of their world, where executioners became healers, folk magicians, and unlikely celebrities. Because of course they did.